Hollywood sold dreams draped in velvet, but behind the curtain its brightest stars were consumed by sin and cursed by addiction. Judy Garland was medicated into obedience. Mickey Rooney gambled away a kingdom, and Tallulah Bankhead flaunted 100 cigarettes a day. These are 16 legends controlled by vices, sometimes by choice, other times by force, and one addiction too strange to imagine. Number 1. Judy Garland, the studio's perfect doll who lived on pills. She was the little girl who made the world believe in rainbows. Yet behind the curtain, Judy Garland was living a life measured not in melodies, but in pills. The same studio that built her into America's sweetheart was also quietly dismantling her spirit. Dose by dose, command by command. MGM's golden child. When she signed her contract at just 13, the studio saw more than a voice. They saw a product. By the time she was cast in The Wizard of Oz, 1939, executives had already decided her body and mind had to be reshaped to fit their vision. At dawn, she was handed pep pills to keep her weight down and her energy high. By night, she was given sedatives to force her into sleep. She would later say that pills were as normal to her as breakfast, and for the young Judy, this chemical carousel became her reality. At 17, when other girls were worrying about school dances, Judy was caught in a daily cycle of stimulants and downers, her every waking moment dictated by studio handlers. The public adored her bright smile and innocent roles. But what they didn't see was a teenager rehearsing until her feet bled, then collapsing backstage, trembling under the fog of medication. In interviews years later, she tried to joke about it. "I lived on pills and despair." But even her laughter could not disguise the truth that her glow was being fueled and slowly destroyed by a bottle of prescriptions. As she matured into stardom, the cycle only deepened. A grueling schedule of films like Meet Me in St. Louis, 1944, and endless tours kept her chained to the chemical regimen. Her voice soared, her presence lit up the screen, but off-camera she grew fragile, unpredictable, and often despondent. Colleagues whispered about her lateness, her exhaustion, her trembling hands. Each breakdown pulled her further into a spiral that no applause could fix. Yet even in her darkest moments, when she walked on stage, she was transformed. A single note could hush a crowd, a single glance could make audiences forget the turmoil consuming her life. That duality, brilliance on stage, chaos behind it, became the tragic irony of Judy Garland. In the end, the studio created their perfect doll, but at the cruelest cost. A woman who gave the world her voice, while slowly losing her own peace. But our next legend's secret was even harder to hide. Number 2, Mickey Rooney, the gambler who lost it all. He was the boy who never grew up on screen, Hollywood's eternal teenager. But off-screen, Mickey Rooney lived like a man chasing danger, rolling dice until his fortune and his life collapsed into smoke. At one point, the highest-paid actor in the world, he would later confess, "I lost it all at the tables." Mickey Rooney, the face of MGM's wholesome musicals, rose to fame in the 1930s and 40s through the Andy Hardy series. Audiences adored his boundless energy and cheeky charm, making him one of the studio's most bankable stars. He worked with Judy Garland in sparkling MGM musicals, his name lighting up marquees across America. But behind that youthful grin, he harbored an appetite for risk that could not be satisfied on set. By the late 1940s, when the studio system began to loosen its grip, Rooney's hunger for control found a dangerous outlet in Las Vegas casinos and backroom card games. At first, it seemed harmless, a leading man blowing off steam between shoots. But soon, the wagers grew bolder, the stakes higher. He would step off sound stages and onto casino floors, where fortunes evaporated in the turn of a card. Twice, he declared bankruptcy. In the 1950s, when his career slowed, his compulsion only grew, as if he were gambling not just with money, but with the last remnants of his stardom. He wasn't just reckless with dice and cards. His personal life mirrored the same chaos. 8 marriages, whispers of financial mismanagement, and endless debts left him scrambling to recapture the stability he once had. To quiet the storm of his mind, Rooney turned to sleeping pills. For decades, he admitted, he couldn't close his eyes without them. Friends recalled him arriving to sets exhausted. His once bright spark dimmed, his words tinged with bitterness. It was a cruel twist. The same man who had danced his way into America's heart was now shuffling through his own life, trapped between insomnia and false relief. By the time he broke free of the pills in his later years, the damage had already been done. In the end, Mickey Rooney embodied both sides of Hollywood's promise: the glory of early fame and the devastation of personal demons. He once had millions, yet died nearly penniless, his fortune gambled away on fleeting thrills. But our next legend's compulsions were even more flamboyant, and she made no attempt to hide them. Number 3. Tallulah Bankhead, the woman who lived out loud. She lit cigarettes like others breathed air. She emptied bottles of bourbon as though they were glasses of water. Tallulah Bankhead never whispered her vices. She turned them into her stage. Tallulah Bankhead, daughter of a powerful Southern politician, swept into Hollywood and Broadway in the 1920s. With a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. She was no ingenue. She was a hurricane. Her performances in films like Lifeboat, 1944, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, revealed a sharp wit and commanding presence. But her fame was only part of her legend. What people remembered most was Tallulah herself. Outrageous, scandalous, and larger than any script could contain. Where others hid their excesses, Tallulah flaunted them. She was said to smoke over 100 cigarettes a day, sometimes puffing through a scene without caring if the camera caught the haze. At parties, she could polish off a bottle of bourbon in less than an hour, daring guests to keep up. Her hotel rooms reeked of tobacco and laughter, and she treated vices as accessories, as much a part of her image as her piercing eyes. She quipped openly about pills, tossing them back with cocktails as though medicine and mischief belonged in the same glass. The more society raised eyebrows, the more she raised her glass. But the flamboyance had its cost. By the 1950s, her health faltered under the strain of decades of unrelenting indulgence. Emphysema clawed at her lungs, and malnutrition hollowed her frame. Even then, she refused to bow to restraint. Reportedly, her final words were a defiant joke: codeine, bourbon. In that moment, she seemed determined to script her own ending, as if death itself had to wait for her last punchline. Tallulah Bankhead was never a woman who lived in shadows. While others cloaked their habits in secrecy, she paraded hers in broad daylight, laughing louder than her critics, and daring the world to keep watching. To this day, she remains the embodiment of excess without apology, a woman who chose spectacle over silence. But the next legend on our list built a cage of secrets so suffocating it turned into his own prison. Number 4. Howard Hughes, the billionaire who built his own cage. He once ruled the skies with airplanes, Hollywood with cameras, and Wall Street with money. Yet Howard Hughes, the man who seemed limitless, spent his final years locked away in darkened rooms, terrified of germs and bound by rituals of his own making. For a man who conquered industries, it was not an empire that undid him, it was himself. Howard Hughes was the golden boy of two worlds, aviation and Hollywood. In the 1930s, he broke speed records with his planes, while producing lavish films like Hell's Angels, 1930, and The Outlaw, 1943. Handsome, brilliant, and endlessly ambitious, he dated starlets from Katharine Hepburn to Ava Gardner. To the outside world, he was the definition of power. But in private, the cracks began to show. After a devastating plane crash in 1946 left him with chronic pain, Hughes turned to codeine and daily injections for relief. What began as treatment soon became dependency, and the genius who once pushed boundaries started retreating into shadows. By the 1950s, his eccentricities deepened into obsession. He refused to shake hands, wrapped doorknobs in tissue, and bathed less and less until he stopped altogether. Entire rooms were lined with paper towels, so he wouldn't touch the world directly. He sat in dark screening rooms for days at a time, replaying the same film. Ice Station Zebra, more than 150 times. Food narrowed to milk and chocolate bars, delivered in sterile conditions. Even as his wealth multiplied, his circle shrank. He dismissed trusted aides, isolated himself in hotels, and became a recluse who communicated through scribbled notes. Hollywood gossiped about his disappearance, but no one could fathom the scale of his decline. The Titan, who once dined with movie queens, now hoarded bottles of his own urine to avoid using bathrooms. The mogul who revolutionized film and flight had become prisoner to tissues, silence, and endless injections. He wasn't the picture of glamour anymore. He was a cautionary tale. Howard Hughes once soared higher than any man of his age, but the very mind that fueled his genius also built his prison. He lived chasing control, yet ended powerless, trapped in a cage of rituals that no wealth could open. And while Hughes hid from the world, our next legend's downfall was written across his once handsome face. Number 5. Montgomery Clift, the beautiful face that fell apart. He was Hollywood's most hauntingly handsome leading man, the actor who could break hearts with a single glance. But one night in 1956, on a winding road in Beverly Hills, Montgomery Clift's face, the very canvas of his career, was shattered. From that moment on, his beauty, his spirit, and eventually his life began to collapse in slow motion. Montgomery Clift, the brooding star of A Place in the Sun, 1951, and From Here to Eternity, 1953, was hailed as a rival to Marlon Brando and James Dean. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Clift wasn't molded by the studios. He chose his own roles, walked away from easy money, and demanded scripts that had depth. To audiences, he was the thinking woman's heartthrob, sensitive, intelligent, and devastatingly magnetic. But behind that control lay fragility. He was intensely private, plagued by insecurities, and quietly leaning on alcohol to steady his nerves. Then came that night in May 1956. Leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, Clift's car crashed into a telephone pole. Taylor herself ran to the wreckage, pulling him from the twisted metal. His jaw was broken, his nose smashed, his face lacerated beyond recognition. For hours, the industry buzzed. Had Hollywood's most beautiful man been destroyed forever? Surgeons pieced him back together, but the scars were permanent. The studio publicity machine tried to shield the truth, but when he reappeared on screen, audiences noticed the change. The swelling, the stiffness, the haunted look in his eyes. Pain became his daily companion. To endure it, doctors prescribed morphine and meperidine. Soon, the relief became necessity, and necessity became dependence. Friends spoke of bottles of pills hidden in drawers, syringes tucked away in his belongings. Alcohol joined the mix, deepening his spiral. On sets, he grew erratic, sometimes slurring lines, sometimes arriving too fragile to work. Edward Dmytryk, who directed him in Raintree County, 1957, described finding a collection of pill bottles so vast it looked like a pharmacy. Montgomery Clift's decline was slow and agonizing. By the 1960s, his once vibrant energy dimmed into a fragile shadow. He was still capable of brilliance. His performance in Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, remains searing, but each triumph was fleeting. Hollywood had once called him the face of the future. Ironically, that very face became the symbol of his undoing. He survived the crash, but he never escaped it. For Montgomery Clift, the accident didn't just scar his body. It rewrote the final act of his life. And while Clift's beauty dissolved in pain, our next legend drowned his crown in a flood of pills and prescriptions. Number 6. Elvis Presley, the king of rock in a pharmaceutical trap. He could command an audience of thousands with the twitch of a hip. But behind the rhinestone jumpsuits and thunderous applause, Elvis Presley was not the master of his own stage. The king of rock was quietly chained to a pharmacy of pills, each capsule tightening its hold until the music itself couldn't set him free. Elvis Presley burst out of Memphis in the mid-1950s, shaking America with a sound and style no one had heard before. Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Love Me Tender. His songs defined a generation. Hollywood soon followed, casting him in a string of light-hearted musicals that made him both a matinee idol and the world's most recognizable face. But fame that arrives like a lightning bolt rarely leaves without burns. By the mid-1960s, Elvis was living under relentless pressure. Grueling tours, film contracts, and the expectations of being the king. To cope, he turned not to wild parties, but to his doctor's pen. At first, the prescriptions seemed routine: stimulants to keep him sharp, tranquilizers to help him rest. But the doses multiplied, year after year, until his medicine cabinet looked like an apothecary. By 1973, he was quietly hospitalized under a false name for his reliance on painkillers. Records show his personal physician prescribed him more than 10,000 pills in a single year. He juggled uppers with downers, waking with one pill, sleeping with another, chasing balance in a chemical storm. The toll was devastating. His once sculpted frame gave way to swelling weight. His eyes, once alight with mischief, grew puffy and vacant. On stage, he sometimes forgot lyrics, his famous gyrations slowing into weary shuffles. Yet even in decline, the crowds still screamed his name, as if sheer adoration could shield him from the battle raging inside. He attempted detox in 1973, but the cycle was too deeply rooted. In August 1977, the king's reign ended at just 42. Officially, his heart gave out. But those close to him knew the truth. It was not one single pill that felled him, but years of entrapment in a pharmaceutical maze, created by doctors who never said no, and a star who could never stop. Elvis Presley didn't lose his crown to rivals or fading fame. He surrendered it piece by piece, in bottles lined neatly on a nightstand. But if Elvis drowned beneath prescriptions, our next legend tried to wash away his grief with spotless rituals of control. Number 7. Clark Gable, the king obsessed with cleanliness. He was the king of Hollywood, the man every man wanted to be and every woman longed to kiss. Yet Clark Gable's carefully crafted charm concealed an obsession that bordered on the bizarre. Behind the rugged smile of Rhett Butler was a man who lived in constant war with germs, odors, and disorder. Clark Gable's rise was meteoric. By the 1930s, he was MGM's crown jewel, starring in It Happened One Night, 1934, and Gone with the Wind, 1939. Performances that cemented him as the ultimate masculine idol. On screen, he was effortless, a man who seemed untouched by weakness. But away from the cameras, Gable clung to rituals that betrayed deep unease. He showered multiple times a day, shaved every inch of body hair, and carried an endless supply of handkerchiefs so he'd never have to touch another person's damp palm. Lavender-scented colognes masked not only sweat, but also the dentures he hid with shame. To the world, he was rugged perfection. In truth, he was terrified of imperfection. Colleagues noticed his scrutiny. Gable would quietly chastise actors or crew members whose grooming didn't meet his standards. Friends recalled that he could barely tolerate sitting in smoky studios without fussing over the smell that clung to his clothes. Some called it a fetish, others a compulsion. But to Gable, it was control. His body, his presence, his aura, all had to remain immaculate. even if maintaining it meant exhausting routines that few ever saw. Then came the tragedy that fractured his carefully managed world. In 1942, his beloved wife, Carole Lombard, was killed in a plane crash. The loss devastated him. His spotless routines, once a shield, began to crumble. He turned to the bottle, arriving on sets disheveled, sometimes drunk, no longer the unshakable king audiences adored. The contrast was painful. The man who once demanded order now surrendered to chaos, undone by grief he could not control. Clark Gable remains immortalized as Hollywood royalty, tall, composed, and irresistible. But those closest to him knew the irony. The king of Hollywood, who seemed to have everything, spent much of his life trying to scrub away the chaos he carried inside. And if Gable's obsession was with control, our next legend sought relief in a different way, by numbing her pain with needles and diamonds. Number 8. Elizabeth Taylor, Diamonds and Demerol. She was the most beautiful woman in the world, wrapped in fur and diamonds, her violet eyes lighting up every camera. Yet when the lights dimmed, Elizabeth Taylor wasn't reaching for jewels. She was reaching for Demerol. The woman who seemed untouchable lived most of her life in pain, seeking relief in syringes and prescription bottles that glittered just as dangerously as her jewels. Elizabeth Taylor became Hollywood royalty almost the moment she appeared on screen. At 12, she galloped through National Velvet, 1944, her eyes captivating audiences and setting the stage for decades of stardom. By the 1950s and 60s, she was commanding $1 million a picture, the first actress ever to do so. Her romances became as famous as her films. 8 marriages, 2 Oscars, and a tabloid presence that never faded. To the public, she was a queen wrapped in mink. To those closest to her, she was a woman battling a body that betrayed her. Arthritis gnawed at her bones. Back injuries from falls left her in chronic pain, and she endured migraines so brutal she once asked her teenage son to inject her with painkillers because she couldn't lift the syringe herself. The drug of choice was Demerol, a powerful opioid that blurred the line between treatment and dependency. Soon, it wasn't just a tool for pain management, it became her daily companion. Relatives later spoke of her reliance with a mixture of love and sorrow, remembering how easily she slipped into the haze of sedation, even in the midst of glittering parties. Taylor never denied her struggles. In fact, she was one of the first megastars to enter rehab publicly in the 1980s, long before such confessions became common. Yet even as she fought to reclaim her health, the cycle of pills lingered, pulling her back into its grip again and again. She spent her life oscillating between elegance and exhaustion, jewels and hospital gowns. Elizabeth Taylor will forever be remembered for her glamour, her scandalous romances, and her fierce presence on screen. But beneath the diamonds lay a woman quietly fighting wars no crown could shield her from. And if Taylor's life was defined by excess wrapped in elegance, our next legend's compulsions were raw, chaotic, and at times almost feral. Number 9. Marlon Brando, the man who devoured life. He could whisper a line and make the world lean closer. Yet offstage, Marlon Brando devoured everything in sight: food, fame, chaos, as if consumption itself was his destiny. The man who redefined acting often lived like a starving soul, chasing comfort in extremes that left him both legendary and broken. Marlon Brando exploded onto the screen with A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951, and On the Waterfront, 1954. Performances that revolutionized Hollywood with their rawness. He wasn't polished like Cary Grant or controlled like Gregory Peck. He was dangerous, magnetic, and unpredictable. Women swooned, men imitated him, and the method acting style he embodied became the new standard. But beneath the genius was a man who could not find balance. His appetites, whether for women, attention, or food, swung like a pendulum from control to chaos. Food became both comfort and curse. He would starve himself for roles, slimming down dramatically for the camera, only to spiral into midnight binges that shocked those around him. One night it might be stacks of cheeseburgers, the next entire boxes of sweets. His second wife, Movita Castaneda, once chained their refrigerator shut to stop his raids. Brando simply bit through the chain, gnawing his way to a block of cheese like a man possessed. On sets, his impulses bled into his performances. During The Godfather, 1972, he famously stuffed his cheeks with food to reshape his face, an artistic flourish born of the same compulsion that plagued him. In another startling moment, he bit into raw liver on camera, leaving crews aghast. But his hunger went beyond the kitchen. Brando devoured life itself. Friends described him as magnetic one moment, destructive the next. A man who needed chaos as much as calm. His weight ballooned in later years, his once godlike physique nearly unrecognizable, mirroring a spirit that had long resisted restraint. The very impulses that made him a genius on screen made him volatile off it. Marlon Brando remains one of Hollywood's brightest stars, a man who lived without boundaries. But his brilliance carried a cruel irony. The very hunger that fed his art was the hunger that hollowed him out. And while Brando devoured life in excess, our next legend quietly withered away, trapped by the sting of a doctor's syringe. Number 10, Peter Lorre, trapped by the syringe. His bulging eyes and eerie voice made him Hollywood's favorite villain. But Peter Lorre, the actor who terrified audiences on screen, was himself caught in a battle far darker than any role he ever played. The syringe that once brought him relief soon became the very trap that consumed him. Peter Lorre's career began in Europe, where he stunned audiences in Fritz Lang's masterpiece, M, 1931. Hollywood quickly imported him, and by the late 1930s he was playing unforgettable roles in The Maltese Falcon, 1941, and Casablanca, 1942. Short, stocky, and strange-looking by studio standards, he created a niche all his own. A chilling presence who stole scenes from taller, handsomer men. But beneath the heavy-lidded stare was a man who lived in constant pain. Chronic gallbladder attacks left him doubled over, and doctors offered what seemed like an easy solution: daily morphine injections. At first, the shots were medical necessity. They dulled the agony and allowed him to keep performing under the hot lights of Warner Brothers. But relief soon became reliance. By the mid-1930s, Lorre realized he couldn't function without the drug. The irony was bitter. The cure was slowly becoming the curse. His weight fluctuated wildly, his once lively energy dimmed, and his body bore the toll of years spent under chemical command. Even as his dependence deepened, Lorre rarely spoke about it. Hollywood whispered, of course, but the studios had a way of keeping their stars' weaknesses out of the headlines. He continued to work, starring in the Mr. Moto detective series and alongside legends like Humphrey Bogart. But those closest to him saw the truth. The haunted eyes weren't just acting. They reflected the torment of a man tethered to a needle. Eventually, he did manage to break free from morphine, but the scars remained. Physical, emotional, and professional. His body never fully recovered, and his career slipped into smaller roles. His once promising stardom dimmed to a flicker. The man who had played so many villains was, in truth, a victim of medicine that promised salvation and delivered chains. Peter Lorre survived Hollywood, but he never truly escaped the shadow of that syringe. His legacy remains a tragic paradox. The actor who frightened millions, yet could not conquer the quiet terror within his own veins. Number 11. Bela Lugosi, Dracula's real curse. He was the man who gave the world its most enduring vampire. Bela Lugosi's chilling stare and hypnotic voice in Dracula 1931 made him immortal. But off-screen, the role became prophecy. The actor who played a creature bound by dark cravings soon found himself enslaved by cravings of his own. Lugosi's rise was as dramatic as his performances. Born in Hungary, he came to America as a refugee of war, struggling with English but thriving on stage presence. Universal Pictures plucked him from obscurity and made him the embodiment of Gothic horror. Cloaked in velvet and shadow, he terrified audiences and cemented himself as a horror icon. Yet behind the cape was a man haunted, not by bats or coffins, but by unrelenting pain. During World War I, he suffered injuries that left him with shooting pains in his legs. By the mid-1930s, doctors offered him morphine for relief. What began as medical salvation slowly tightened into a prison. One injection became a routine, then a necessity. Soon, Lugosi was unable to face a day of filming without the drug's grip. His dependence stretched across decades. When he tried to quit, doctors substituted other narcotics like Demerol, only deepening the spiral. For nearly 20 years, he lived between brief relief and long torment. His work performed in the narrow spaces between doses. The impact on his career was devastating. Studios once eager to capitalize on his Dracula fame grew hesitant. By the 1940s, he was typecast. Appearing in low-budget horror pictures, his once commanding presence weakened. Fans still adored him, but insiders whispered about his frailty, his nervousness, his constant need for relief. At the height of his decline, he finally admitted publicly what few stars of the era dared confess. He was dependent on narcotics. It was a rare act of honesty, a plea for help from a man more vulnerable than any monster he portrayed. Bela Lugosi spent his final years fighting to reclaim dignity. He sought treatment, but his legacy had already been written. The man who once embodied eternal life was left frail, penniless, and dependent, buried in the same Dracula cape that had defined and cursed his career. Hollywood remembered Dracula's immortal words. The tragedy was that Bela Lugosi himself could never escape the bite. Number 12. Cary Grant, the gentleman of LSD. He was the very picture of elegance, tall, charming, and perfectly tailored. Yet Cary Grant, Hollywood's eternal gentleman, carried a secret no tuxedo could hide. Behind the polished smile was a man who willingly stepped into a world of swirling colors and chemical visions, convinced that the key to happiness lay inside a glass vial. Cary Grant, star of classics like North by Northwest, 1959, and An Affair to Remember, 1957, defined sophistication for an entire generation. He seemed immune to scandal, a self-made man who had reinvented himself from Archie Leach, a poor English boy, into Hollywood royalty. On screen, he was wit and control personified. Off-screen, however, his private life was less certain. Failed marriages, deep insecurities, and unresolved childhood trauma left him searching for peace. By the 1950s, Grant found what he believed was salvation, not in another role or romance, but in lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Under the guidance of psychiatrist Dr. Humphrey Osmond, Grant reportedly underwent nearly 100 supervised sessions. He claimed the experiences stripped away layers of pain, exposing a truer, freer self. Friends recalled him speaking with evangelical fervor about the drug's power to heal. He encouraged colleagues to try it, insisting it was not a vice but a spiritual tool. But whispers soon spread of darker moments. His ex-wife, actress Diane Cannon, later revealed that he attempted to share the experience with her by secretly dosing her drink, a revelation that cast a shadow over his gentlemanly image. Hollywood, at the time, had no language for such confessions. The studios avoided the subject, preferring to let audiences see only the impeccable suits and debonair smile. Yet privately, Grant was rewriting his life through chemical therapy. convinced that enlightenment could be bottled. To some, he was a pioneer, decades ahead of conversations about psychedelics and mental health. To others, he was a man caught in dangerous experimentation. In the end, Cary Grant remained what he always had been, an enigma. The gentleman who played it safe on screen was willing to risk everything in search of inner calm. His life became proof of a haunting irony. The man who had everything still believed he needed more. Number 13. Marilyn Monroe, medicated into silence. She was Hollywood's brightest flame, yet her light flickered in a haze of pills and whispered betrayals. Marilyn Monroe, the world's eternal blonde bombshell, lived a life scripted by studios and medicated by doctors, until silence became her final performance. By the 1950s, Monroe was the crown jewel of 20th Century Fox. Films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 1953, and The 7-Year Itch, 1955, made her a symbol of laughter, sensuality, and vulnerability. Audiences adored her, but behind the camera, she was treated as a commodity. Studios demanded perfection, a flawless smile, a punctual star, a woman who could deliver charm on cue. What they got instead was a fragile soul, trembling under the weight of expectation. Her stage fright was legendary. Panic attacks left her unable to walk on set, and insomnia haunted her nights. Doctors responded the way Hollywood always did in that era, with prescriptions. At first, they were little helpers, pills to ease sleep or calm nerves. But as productions dragged on and scandals mounted, the bottles multiplied. Friends recalled her bathroom counters lined with amber vials, each one promising peace. Yet the peace never lasted. Her marriages, to Joe DiMaggio, to Arthur Miller, collapsed under the strain. Lovers came and went, leaving her more isolated. The studio bosses, eager to protect their investment, often fueled the cycle by sending new doctors with stronger prescriptions. By the early 1960s, Monroe's health was unraveling in public. She was dismissed from the set of Something's Got to Give in 1962 after repeated absences, blamed on illness but whispered to be exhaustion from her nightly chemical routine. Reporters painted her as unreliable, yet those close to her saw a woman caught between relentless fame and the numbing fog of medication. Even President Kennedy's rumored connection to her couldn't shield her from the gossip or the loneliness. On August 5, 1962, the world awoke to news that Monroe was gone. Found in her Los Angeles home, a fatal mix of pills having stilled the voice that once charmed millions. She was only 36. The official story called it tragedy. Some called it mystery, but those who knew her best said it was the inevitable end of a system that had medicated her into silence. Hollywood had crafted the perfect fantasy in Marilyn Monroe. The cruel irony was that the woman beneath the fantasy never found her own happy ending. Number 14. Frank Sinatra, showered in lavender. He was the chairman of the board, the swaggering voice of mid-century America. Yet Frank Sinatra, the man who could silence a room with one note, was also haunted by whispers, stories of rage, romance, and a peculiar obsession with the color lavender. Behind the crooner's tailored suits and smoky ballads, there was a man who demanded control of everything, down to the shade of his towels. Sinatra's rise was meteoric. From Hoboken saloons to the glittering stages of Las Vegas, he defined cool for a generation. Songs like My Way and Strangers in the Night etched his voice into the fabric of America. On screen, he won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity, 1953, proving he was more than just a singer. But Sinatra's legend wasn't built only on talent. It was fueled by bravado. He cultivated an image of toughness, bolstered by his ties to the Rat Pack and his rumored friendships with powerful men, some of them in politics, others in far murkier circles. And yet, for all his bravado, Sinatra had quirks that made him the target of hushed jokes in Hollywood backrooms. Chief among them, his obsession with lavender. Friends, lovers, and hotel staff confirmed it. Sinatra insisted his homes and suites be stocked with lavender-scented soap, lavender candles, even lavender-colored towels. To his fans, it might have seemed like eccentricity, but to insiders, it revealed something else. A man terrified of chaos, trying to control his world through rituals of comfort. Still, the rituals couldn't calm his infamous temper. Sinatra's rages were as legendary as his songs. He could charm a president one evening and hurl a glass across the room the next. Women fell under his spell: Ava Gardner, Mia Farrow. But few lasted long against the storms of jealousy and anger. The lavender showers, the perfectly staged hotel rooms, were just a fragile shield against the volatility inside. As the years wore on, Sinatra's contradictions deepened. The lavender followed him to his final days, even as his health declined. In the end, the man who had conquered every nightclub and stage still clung to the color that brought him comfort. It was the strangest irony. America's toughest crooner sought solace not in whiskey, not in cigars, but in lavender-scented silence. Number 15. John Huston, the director who gambled on everything. He rolled dice the way he directed movies, with swagger, danger, and no regard for what tomorrow might bring. John Huston, the towering figure behind The Maltese Falcon, 1941, and The African Queen, 1951, wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a gambler by nature, betting his fortune, his marriages, and sometimes even his reputation on risky ventures that could have destroyed anyone else. Hollywood knew Huston as a maverick. He was the man who could coax legends like Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn into giving career-defining performances. His films were bold, cynical, and unforgettable, earning him Academy Awards and the reputation of a genius. But while the cameras adored him, the casinos did too. Huston haunted the poker tables of Las Vegas and the racetracks of California, chasing the high of a win with the same reckless passion he brought to the set. And gambling wasn't his only vice. Huston gambled on people, marrying 5 times, chasing romances that burned hot and ended in ashes. His liaisons with actresses and socialites were as notorious as his scripts. Colleagues whispered about the wild nights, the lost fortunes, and the dangerous deals he made in Mexico, where he built a lavish estate and lived like a king surrounded by artists, drifters, and opportunists. For Huston, life itself was a poker game, and folding was never an option. The irony was that his boldness often worked. Films shot in hostile jungles, projects the studios thought insane, somehow turned into masterpieces. But there was always a cost. Fortunes won at the tables evaporated with the next roll of the dice. Friendships soured when money was borrowed and never repaid. Even his children, including actress Angelica Houston, bore the scars of a father who was present in legend but often absent in life. By the time Huston was confined to a wheelchair and tethered to an oxygen tank in his later years, he had lived several lives in one. The director who gave the world gritty realism had himself been living in a haze of chance and chaos. It was the greatest gamble of all, a man who risked everything and somehow won immortality. Number 16. Clara Bow, the it girl in the sanitarium. She was the very embodiment of jazz-age freedom, a red-headed comet blazing across silent screens. But Clara Bow, the original it girl, would end her days not in glittering premieres, but behind sanitarium walls, her laughter drowned out by whispers of scandal and betrayal. Clara Bow was Paramount's brightest star of the 1920s, her magnetic presence igniting films like It, 1927, and Wings, 1927. She wasn't the porcelain doll Hollywood had peddled before. She was raw, modern, and irresistibly alive. Men adored her, women envied her, and the studios cashed in on every ounce of her energy. But for all the box office triumphs, Bow never escaped the wounds of a brutal childhood, poverty in Brooklyn, a violent father, and a mother plagued by illness. That past left her vulnerable, and in the harsh machine of Hollywood, vulnerability was blood in the water. The gossip columns feasted on her. She was accused of everything from wild affairs with co-stars to shocking indiscretions with servants. Some stories were exaggerations, others outright fabrications. But in a puritanical America, such rumors could wound deeper than truth. Studio executives, who had once crowned her their golden goose, began to distance themselves as talkies took hold, and new starlets emerged. By the early 1930s, the same Hollywood that had worshipped Clara seemed eager to bury her. But the most devastating blow came not from headlines, but from her own mind. Crippling anxiety and emotional breakdowns left her unable to perform. At just 28, Bow retired from films, marrying cowboy actor Rex Bell and retreating to a Nevada ranch. For a time, it seemed the country life might save her. Yet the demons of her past returned, louder than ever. She checked into sanitariums, enduring treatments that left her fragile. Her once vibrant spirit dimmed. For fans, it was unthinkable. The carefree girl who had once danced across speakeasies on screen, now hidden away, silenced by the very society that had once celebrated her freedom. Clara Bow had defined it for an entire generation, that mysterious spark of allure and vitality. But when the cameras stopped rolling, the world that had taken everything from her offered nothing back. She died in 1965, far from the spotlight, her name already fading from the marquee. The cruelest irony? The it girl of Hollywood was left with nothing. Not even it, in the end. Their fame glittered, but behind the lights, many were consumed by sin, cursed by addiction, medicated and controlled. Hollywood gave them immortality on screen, yet tragedy off it. If these stories moved you, share your thoughts below and let us know. Your voice keeps these memories alive.